Hey, how do you migrate projects to OpenRoads? There's actually a lot of documentation on that. However, it tends to be things like how do I take a GPK and get it over to a DGN? How do I take an ALG? How do I take a DTM? Um, the reality is there's a big area in the middle that hasn't been covered very well, and that is how do you get your DGNs? Okay, so if you have a project that's got a lot of DGNs in it, what do you do with those? Okay, I know of at least one site that's having trouble with what do we do with our DGNs. So also, you can call this what to project when you're projecting. Um, Parents might giggle at that. Um, Starting from the absolute basics here, the basic unit of OpenRoads is the feature. Okay, that's a graphic element and it's connected to some additional stuff. A name, a feature definition. These are kind of BIM requirements. It needs to be separatable from something other than just a layer. So it starts with a fundamental unit, the feature, it's BIM ready. And the really nice thing compared, if you go back, it's like it's extensible. You can add item types. So whatever data you need to store associated with an object in space, a future object in space, a past, you can store it. So you can track data intrinsically, which is brilliant, and it's absolutely essential to turning your model into something that's embraced by the owner operator. It's BIM ready, it's digital twin ready. That is the fundamental unit of OpenRoads. Okay, now these fundamental units are stored in a container. Basic container is not the DGN, it's a model. Okay, and there are several types of models. The design models tend to be where the engineering occurs. It could be 2D, it can be 3D. In the case of OpenRoads projects, you have a 2D, 3D combined together. It manages that. Okay, in say inroads, you typically add a 2D or a 3D design model. You also have drawing models, which tend to be 2D references to those design models, and they're kind of there's a lot of reasons for them, but ultimately sheet models, which tend to have space, constrained space, sheet size, they reference drawing models, which so the model is the basic unit, is the basic container in the OpenRoads platform, in the Bentley Common Data environment. It's the model, not the DGN. Okay, so DGN is not the basic container. The DGN is the wrapper. It is like an XLS file and a container of things inside it. So like Excel is a collection of sheets. Okay, we have multiple sheets in there. DGN, same thing, multiple models. Okay, and the cell might be the basic unit of a spreadsheet, but it's wrapped in, contained in a sheet, which is contained in the XLS. So that is what's happening here. So there are, in addition to the types, the formal architecture of types, conceptually we have a variety of model data. So for example, the source, the design data, the design model tends to be your source information. It can be drawings, it can be sheets, but it's the core. It tends to be the stuff that's managed by the software. Okay. Derived are things that are not directly written to. It's not the direct model, but it's part of the overall production, which sheets and plan sets. Okay, they are. There's a lot of files. There's a subset, a Venn diagram of things that are derived. It's not core. It's not irrelevant. It's managed by the software. It may have stuff added by the software, managed by the software. Automatic labels. Automatic labels are a big thing. Sheet setup, the position of it. Okay, that is derived. Again, no real model data in there. It's derived from the model, managed by the software. And then finally, you have independent stuff, which is it has nothing to do with the software, the engineering software you're using. It could be an aerial photo. It can be a tile file for an entire county. It's anything that's not live. Okay. Dumb graphics, if you will. Okay. So when you're looking at a project, it may consist of a whole bunch of models, engineering design models, source data, if you will, a lot of derived models and independent models. Okay. And notice I'm using models and not DGNs. Okay. Because these models here can be contained in a variety of ways. Okay. So in OpenRoads now, there used to be some constraints in the past where it's like, well, if it's in a reference file, you're going to lose certain functionality. You lost stuff you didn't want to lose. That's far less of a problem now. And federating your data logically there's very few constraints to that, very few limitations. So referencing works really well and allows you to store your data the way you want. Okay, there are some extremes. All right, and you want to be somewhere in the middle. Okay, so one extreme, one end of the spectrum is every model has its own DGN. So you might have a 2D DGN, you might have a sheet drawing DGN, and for every sheet you might have its own DGN. Okay, there are a lot of places that do that, especially initially when this stuff first came out. They're like, hey, we want a sheet for everything, and that's okay. The one thing you have to be careful of is, and you can't do it. Don't think you can do it. Don't work to try to find out how to do it. The 2D, 3D model that comes in OpenRoads, and this was new. It's like, hey, we got 2D and 3D. It's in the same DGN. Okay, those OpenRoads models you want to keep together. Okay, and I don't think you can pry them apart. So it is okay, and there's a lot of common practice where for every model you have your own DGN. Now the reality is that's not an absolute. Here's the other end of the spectrum, and this is really this was, except for really small projects, really bad idea. This was bad practice back in the old days, bad practice in inroads. It is bad practice now. Okay, so just no, just no on that. Okay, don't do that. Figure that. It's not good practice. It wasn't good practice then, not good practice now. So first of all, it's bad data management. For example, imagine a file folder system and all you can see is the folders. You can't see any of the files in it. That's what putting all those model in a DGN is like. Oh, I said DWG. Anyway, you can't see in it, so it's a black box. Okay, so having those models up higher at the file level, there's an advantage. You can see from just browsing your file system, ProjectWise or whatever, you see it right. You don't have to open the software to get an understanding what's going on. The other thing is bloat. Bloat is really bad. Dumping everything in one file has all sorts of problems. And one thing I do want to point out, some old versions of ORD, particularly in the drainage, they tend to get corrupted. So if you're doing an engineering model using OpenRoads in a DGN file, and that gets corrupted, and you have the entire project in that DGN file, you can't open that DGN file. You just lost access to the whole project. So that alone is reason to stay far, far away from it. Okay, and bloat is just bad in general. I know of at least one case where, hey, this file's 120 meg and it's a problem. It's slow. It's flaky. It turns out there was like 100 megabyte tile file of the entire county in there. It was a dead, independent, dumb graphic. Should have been a reference to. So who knows how many projects had a DGN with a 100 megabyte DGN model inside it. And the reality was there was only, say, 4 megabytes of actual engineering in that 120 megabyte file. So bloat is bad for writing code. It's bloat for software. It's bad for a variety of things. So bloat is something you want to avoid. This is just bad practice. So step one before you move forward is figure out where you're at. You got to understand your current state. So take a look at your project. Things may be broken up by DGN file. It could be in one giant DGN file. Everything could be stuffed in there. You got to figure out how your engineering is organized. You need to figure out how your sheets are organized. So your derived stuff, how's that organized? Finally, take a look. What's your independent stuff? Is your independent stuff your static, bloaty stuff that doesn't belong in an active engineering file managed by OpenRoads? Is that stuff in a model it shouldn't be? Can you pull it out? That's huge if you can do that. Okay. So understand your current state. Okay. And recognize this. This is the biggest cost. Well, this is an unavoidable cost of reorganization. Okay. Anytime you reorganize things, reorganize those models. Okay. Your links will not go automatically. So if you take some stuff out of here and you move it over there, you have to follow that. You got to point to it. Your old links will probably break, and you have to manage that. Now with container files, and these are especially with live referencing, throughout the course of a project, you just throw things in a container file. Everybody referencing that container file with live nesting will get things automatically. So that means the creator who's adding new stuff, he does his job, he manages it. Everybody else, the consumer of that data, they don't have to worry about it. It's all there. It comes in automatically, so it's beautiful, it's wonderful. So that's The reorganization has a cost up front of getting the reference files changed, but with container files, it can be mitigated quite a bit. Okay, deserves its own video. Container files are awesome. Okay, here's the issue though. This is the biggest issue. So after you get your references cleaned up, the derived stuff, the software managed data, not the actual engineering models tend to migrate directly, not an issue. It's the derived stuff that's a challenge. So for example, sheets, live automatic labeling that took so long to get there in Geopack and in OpenRoads, and it's like, hey, we finally have really good labeling that's automatic. Well, that you lose that, okay, because the live links in inroads don't go over to live links in OpenRoads. You got to just push a button and get them all in new. One of the issues is that's easy enough. That's really not that hard. The hard part is all that work you did to make sure the labels aren't popping on top of each other. Any of the manual typing you did, that's dead. Okay, so that's the biggest. That is really the biggest challenge. Is, hey, I've got all these sheets set up. They're perfectly. I'm not doing a whole bunch of work. Just a little bit of work. Do I have to migrate this stuff forward? Okay, and yeah, that redrafting, it does cripple the migration. Okay. Because you're like, hey, I've got 3 days to do, 2 inlets just to change them. So I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to migrate my sheets forward. I'm not going to do new labels. I'm not going to sync everything up. I'm going to have, I call these bailout points. I'm going to bail out. In fact, you're not even bailing out. You're not taking the step forward. But I'm going to have sheets that are manually managed, and I'll have my automatic design stuff, but I'm going to have manually edited sheets. And, ultimately you start, oh, I only have this, I only have this, I only have this. And the reality is you wind up not migrating. And sometimes you got to do it just because you don't have a lot of time and you're only doing small changes and the deadline is yesterday. But be aware, that's probably that is the biggest hindrance to migrating things and going best practices all the way. Okay, the practices that the software was architected for. Okay. Migrating the design models is pretty easy. Again, your design data is ALG, DTM, GPK, all that stuff. There's direct paths forward. It's documented. There is other DGN data that's probably valuable that you want to manage. Okay, but that tends to be a fairly minor thing. You may organize things differently, and that just means you got to make sure your references are updated. Make sure your drainage models get their own DGNs. Okay. Migrating the independents is easy. The big thing is your independent stuff, is it in a DGN? Do you have big, huge static graphics in a model that's stuck in a important DGN? If you can pull out the big stuff into their own files, certainly get them out of anything with live data in it, anything that will have OpenRoads data in it. You really don't want to burden the OpenRoads workflow with stuff you don't need in there. So that's a big thing. Again, how you organize them, because it's not live, because the software is generally not reading it, not always true. There's really not much of a hit as far as project integration. It's simply, how do you want to organize these things? So that's fairly straightforward. I mentioned this earlier. Do I start my sheets over? That's the big question. Okay, and again, it depends on your deadline. Just recognize that if you do not start them over, you will be stuck with drafting manual methods until you move forward. And when are you ever going to have big time and the tail end of a project to move things forward and use best practices? Not often. So that's a challenge there. So in summary, you got to know what your current layout is, okay? Your model layout. What's your mapping of how the data is managed? And again, you got your engineering source, which is really important. Your derived, which is going to be your pivotal stuff. Your independent, manage that well. Get your garbage, your giant garbage out where it belongs, out to the side, not intrinsic to the engineering models, okay? So understand where you're at. Plan again, the engineering stuff's easy because it's ALG to DGN, it's DTM, all that stuff's documented pretty well. Independence, again, if you got garbage that's static, you don't want it encapsulated into any of the engineering, the live stuff, any of the managed stuff, okay? And the big question, and that is really the big thing, is what's your plan on sheets? If you got plenty of time, you're going to create new sheets. You're going to create new. You're going to do the labeling. Yeah, how often do you have plenty of time? So the question is, if you got just a little bit of work to do and a quick deadline, can you do manual? It's up to you. Also, just recognize that container files are a way to nest DGNs within DGNs, and the reality is you link to a container file with live nesting. Someone can throw something in there. Hey, there's a new utility file that just got surveyed. You throw it in there, it automatically shows up, persists itself to end users. The consumers of that data, that specialty, gets it automatically. They're not responsible for having to know everything that's going on. And you can set that up in your, and I recommend this, set that up in your project setup. You can have some seed files that already have references. That's a whole nother presentation. I hope I get to it because it's really damn important. Oops, really darn important. So, all right, thanks.